Good evening. Yeah, it's going to be trouble with those two guys, I tell you. Okay. Poets are the perfect revolutionaries, Fanny Howe once said to me as we walked past the recently shuttered Café Pamplona. To which I said, catching her drift, yes. Even a revolution needs a place to meet. From cafes to bookstores, poets are the often unacknowledged makers of so many transformational meeting places and generative sites of congregation, illumination, libation, and provocation. On this Patriots' Day, we come together to honor the persistent independence and idiosyncrasy, and yes, sometimes downright weirdness, of a bookstore in our midst that has shaped our very midst. Its independence and its valiant struggle to remain so has been the fulcrum of our community and its collection of changes. I speak, of course, of the Grolier Poetry Bookstore. In honoring the bookstore, we also celebrate the persistence of our art form because the Grolier is in many ways the embodiment of poetry itself, its constellatory capacity to construct intimacy out of vastness and to bring together unlike entities into an inimitable new synthesis. I pulled out the big words just for this occasion. Ever since founding the Oral History Initiative at Harvard in 2011, with a conversation with John Ashbery about his friend Frank O'Hara, it's long been my wish to conduct an oral history about this beloved bookstore. But it was not until this year, with funding from Tom Healy, that we were able to actualize this vision and to add another layer that I've long envisioned, that of hosting public recording sessions at the Grolier itself to document a larger, more comprehensive narrative. The Community Megaphone Initiative, as we're calling it, allowed us to give a small grant to Grolier manager James Fraser to help support his work on a short film that will open this event this evening and a pop-up exhibit that he curated of Elsa Dorfman's photographs that you will see during the reception in the poetry room. I can't read what I wrote after this, but it probably says something like, we were also able to have funding to do a day-long series of recordings at the shop tomorrow, which are almost entirely booked up except for 2 slots, which I can help you all reserve later tonight. I'm immensely grateful to James. Let's give an applause to James. And to Harvey Silvergate for his generous permission to let us display prints of Elsa Dorfman. And I'm also grateful to you, so now you're going to hold your applause, in advance for the stories that you will share, because actually the grand finale of this event is your stories about the Grolier, and we'll be going around with mics afterwards. Anyway, I'm going to let this conversation get under the way, but before I do, we are going to show the film that I mentioned, and then our fearless leader, Lloyd Schwartz, will come up with all of our guests and begin this conversation. Thanks so much.
This reading of the story of Nabucco from Collage is dedicated to you, dear Gordon Kearney. From the first day I met you in your bookshop, we were friends for life. We wrote to each other over the years. You were famous for your genuine love of books and writers. And here I use the word famous in the French definition, fameux, which means marvelous, a marvelous person.
The Grolier Bookshop has survived at the edge of Harvard Square for nearly 60 years without selling volumes on how to grow thin, rich, or happy. Louisa Solano keeps it going on the sale of visions, the visions of poets.
I walked into the store when I was 15, started helping the original owner, Gordon Canny, on Saturdays and after school. Supported myself at other jobs and always came back to help him on weekends. When he died in '73, and I was unemployed and without any money whatsoever, 10 of his customers got together, got a bank loan for me, and I got the store.
I come across one other store like this in my life, and that was a place called Turret Books in London. That was a long time ago. It's out of business now.
Poetry in this country is largely an art without honor, and it's extraordinary to have a place where one can come and get the books one needs that sells the books of poets.
Among the heavyweights who have visited the Grolier are Robert Frost, T.S. Eliot, and Marianne Moore.
I just felt the poets deserved a store that represented their interests and their work. And no other place was willing to do it. And since I care about it, it was natural.
Thank you.
The 10 years of Louisa Solano's ownership have been more important to art than to the IRS. Last year, her weekly take-home pay stayed largely in the path of penury.
Between 100 and 150 a week. Now it's about 175, but basically it's, it's minimum. When people find out what I do for a living, a lot of people will tell me, I like poetry, but I don't show it to my friends. It happens all the time. I deal with poets all the time. I think they're average people. They can be any kind, any type, any nationality, be housewives, be professors, be mechanics, be taxi cab drivers, be waitresses. It doesn't matter.
Perhaps John Keats spoke for all the poets when he said, "A thing of beauty is a joy forever. Its loveliness increases. It will never pass into nothingness, but still will keep a bower quiet for us, and a sleep full of sweet dreams and health and quiet breathing."
I have a feeling that this is probably the oldest poetry bookshop in the country. It's just a labor of love, and I think poetry means a lot to many of us, and we're trying to keep the place going. Nobody buys books now. Bookstores are a problem, especially poetry, but it's really a labor of love. Poetry means a lot, I think. I don't think we've given it enough credit for its healing powers.
Hi, this is Chen Chen. I'm a poet, and I love the Grolier Poetry Bookshop.
Hi, it's Stephanie Burt, and I have been going to the Grolier Poetry Bookshop for really most of my life at this point. I remember meeting Louisa Solano in it in 1989 and purchasing a copy of Linnea Ginian's My Life. I remember encountering Killarney Clary's first book of prose poems, Who Whispered Near Me, there, and having that blow me away. I remember just going there to browse in the early 90s and again in the early 20-teens, and I'm so happy it's there for readings and for events and for used books and for new books and for international books and for domestic books and for everything that we really need all poetry spaces for and is a gathering place for the next generation.
When I lived for 25 years in Boston, the only serious place to browse and buy poetry was the Grolier, over which Louisa Solano vigilantly presided. And it was the place to hear poetry in those crowded, intimate readings, like sessions of a mystery cult.
Hi, I'm Forrest Gander, and I don't come to Cambridge without going to Grolier's.
The coolest thing that ever happened to me in the Grolier Poetry Bookshop was that I once stood next to the poet John Wieners, who was carrying two big bags that looked like they were full of drafts of poems, and he was looking at a copy of the sonnets of William Shakespeare. That was my second day in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1998.
Grolier Poetry Bookshop, what an extraordinary place you are for treasures of the literary and humankind. Thank you, Mankitti family, James Fraser, Grolier staff for maintaining the breadth and breadth of poetry in the Boston, Cambridge area and beyond it.
There's the Vatican. There's Jerusalem. There's Mecca. And there's a Grolier. There's Paris in the 20s, the Village in the 50s, and there's the Grolier. Then and now. Enough said.
My first venture into the Grolier was some 43 years ago, after I graduated from college, and I began graduate school at Harvard and wanted to be a poet. And I felt that when I had entered that bookstore, I had hit Poetry Central. Over the years, I've thought of Grolier often, and it's been wonderful the last 20 years being back in Boston, wandering into the Grolier with its new manager, and Ifeanyi for many years being such a welcoming presence. It's been a grateful and wonderful presence in my life as a writer for a very long time.
Hi, I'm Peter Gizzi, and I'm really happy to contribute to the celebration of the Grolier. I remember when I was 18 or 19, I remember taking a trip from Pittsfield, where I grew up, to Cambridge to visit this fabled poetry bookstore, and it was great. I found so many cool books that, were essential to me. And but I think maybe the most exciting time, or one of the most exciting times for the Grolier, is happening right now under the stewardship of James Fraser. He's doing remarkable work. We're so lucky to have this new life, this person who's so invested in bringing it back to its full capacity. I mean, the Grolier is a venerable institution for poetry, and particularly for Cambridge. So I'm very grateful for his energy and his belief and his goodwill. And congratulations to the Grolier.
Wanga atira Navayuk. Oiva miurunga slikar miurunga. I'm Joan Navayuk Kane, called for my namesake Navayuk, who, along with my ancestors from Owibok, King Island, and Koyuk, Mary's Igloo, Alaska, remind me of the importance of poetry, of language, of community. And I want to talk about how Grolier has anchored my love of poetry ever since I was a teenager, helped me find poetry in life, and through poetry helped me return and bring other poets along with me to King Island, Owibok. And I hope that Grolier continues to help us navigate our way through these times and through the world, through language, with each other, always with poetry in mind. Thanks to Grolier. I love the Grolier.
Hello, everybody. It's Brenda Hillman. I'm so happy to help celebrate the existence of one of the great literary bookstores, the Grolier. I live on the West Coast, so it took me a little while to make it over there, but I was really struck by the magical and intense quality of its interior and the careful selections that Louisa made. And I also appreciated the newsletter of the Grolier and had a had a few books featured there, and it seemed like a big literary event to have something featured in the newsletter. So let's go on supporting the Grolier and our other independent literary bookstores by buying books in person, and really happy that it exists.
Grolier is this timeless relic that continues to capture hearts and imaginations, and I think that speaks to the enduring need for art in our culture and community.
Thank you, Christina, for this whole project, not just tonight, but over the years. And James, thank you for the marvelous film. And yeah. And for helping to organize this, and for all the work that you do at the Grolier and on behalf of poetry. We are all grateful to you. We have a very distinguished group of people up here sharing their memories, sharing their memories about the Grolier, but I have a feeling that probably most of you in the audience could be up here as well with your own stories and memories and experiences at the Grolier. And I hope that you will all contribute, those of you who feel free to contribute your own comments. And I would even, I speak for myself perhaps only, even feel free to interrupt us if you have some additional comment to make. I will try to keep my eye peeled. I started going to the Grolier when I came to Cambridge as a graduate student in 1962. And I found one of the things that was thrilling about Cambridge was that it had a poetry bookstore, or a bookstore where you could get all the poetry practically that you needed. Harvard wanted its students to get their course books at the Harvard Coop, and which I did, except for poetry books. And I was damned if I was going to get poetry books at the Coop when there was a poetry bookstore. To be perfectly honest, it was a challenge for me to visit the Grolier because I didn't particularly feel welcome. I felt that there was a kind of club of people who were Gordon Kearney's friends, his younger friends. They were all nice people. Some of them were extremely good poets. but they didn't make me feel comfortable visiting. And I would go and I would buy my book and sometimes wait around for someone to take my money. That didn't seem the most important thing about selling poetry books. Then when Louisa took over, there was a very different atmosphere, and for a while, it was a much freer and more welcoming atmosphere. Louisa was the person who offered me my very first book signing party. And the day before the book signing, when my books hadn't arrived in the store yet, I drove down with Louisa to this little town near Plymouth where the book factory was located, and we carried a couple of cartons of my book back to the store. I see Rod Kessler in the audience. Rod took the picture of me, the author photograph on my first book. So, the people, some of you were around in those days. Then things got dicey, and Louisa was not in very good health, and I think she was taking a very complicated recipe of medications, and she got very paranoid. And she got very paranoid, especially about people coming into the Grolier. And she installed one of those alarms that would go off when people were coming into the Grolier. And there's a horrible story. I mean, if you want to mention the name of the very well-known and respected regular at the Grolier, who came into the Grolier and set off the alarm. And Louisa insisted on checking his book bag for stolen books, and he refused, and she threw him out of the store, and the next day, or 2 days later, he got a letter from her lawyer with a restraining order forbidding him from ever setting foot in the Grolier again. That's a terrible story. It's also not the only story. So that got very complicated, and I think a lot of people felt uncomfortable again going back into the store. And then Ifeanyi Menkidi bought the store, and the whole atmosphere changed. And Ifeanyi was a philosophy professor and a poet. He was not a book dealer. And I think he had to get his footing running the store. But again, it was just a pleasure to return to the Grolier. And even Louisa, there was a rule, she had a rule that people couldn't browse. I mean, this was not a good idea for a bookstore. I'm not making this up. But now with the Menkidis owning the store and James essentially running it, it's the best part of Cambridge again. So I'm going to ask, well, you can see the names on your program, and you can read about the great distinctions of the people who are speaking. Before you begin, it's Fanny Howe and Gail Mazer and John Yao and Robert Pinsky and Carol Menkidi are our official speakers, but you should feel welcome to be our unofficial speakers. So Fanny, how would you begin with your recollections of the Grolier?
Well, I'm just grateful you said all that you did, because that sort of clears that out.
Oh, good.
And now we can start. I'm really glad, because honestly, people have wondered what the trajectory and the movements were. It was good you just summarized it. And also I'm glad James played Ave Maria, because the women returned. And saved it from those men shouting and smoking in the old days. Were they allowed to smoke when Gordon was there? Yeah,
Yes,
okay.
they were.
Yeah.
I have that recollection of smoke coming
It was
in.
quite a smoky shop.
But to me, because I'm probably the oldest person in the room, I actually used to go into Harvard Square when I was 15 or 14 to pick up boys. And so I had my girlfriends, and we would wander around and he.
How'd you do?
Nothing ever happened. But my sense of the place was it had these stopping off points, ones which were not just commercial, but there was the Poets Theater on Palmer Street, which seemed like to be a projection out of the Grolier. They were connected, old-fashioned, and fun. And fun is the important thing. I remember E.E. Cummings was a wonderful influence on young people. He was just such a cheerful poet. He was just great. But then there was the other side. Who was it who wrote The Cambridge Women Who Live in Curtained Souls? It's a really terrible indictment of women in Cambridge. Does anybody not know that poem?
I thought Cummings did write that, but
no,
or else Eliot. I think it was Cummings.
It was Cummings. I thought so too. Yeah. But who talks about Cummings anymore? And you do? Good.
But are you saying that Cummings would go to the bookstore?
No, we read him, and in a way that was voracious and happy, and not frightening to young people. And I associate him with the kind of atmosphere around the Grolier way back in the early 50s. And yeah.
In the 50s, you described once seeing Robert Lowell with your father over at the faculty club. Did you see him at the Grolier as well?
I'm sure I did. It would have been later. It would have been when he was close friends with the Gowries from England, and they'd come in and hang out there all together. But I was thinking of Jim Tate and Paul Hennigan, who were just great spirits. And
was he one of the men you picked up?
I told you it came to nothing. So, anyway. No, and notice that my photograph is not on the walls. I might be the only person of my generation. Gail Mazer was the most beautiful woman that they let in.
You were the most beautiful woman that they
She
let
was
into the
allowed
store.
into that smoke-filled room. And she was so beautiful.
I was married.
The books. Anyway, I do think of her as central. You were central. Yes. And they didn't mind. And then the whole atmosphere I've only seen sort of reproduced when I was living in England, and it still carries that ambiance. And so it is a kind of, just by going in the door, you're crossing into another century, another way of thinking. And it's very moving to be there still. Jim Tate was very young and just coming to be known by anyone, but he was there a lot with all of them.
You've seen that photograph of a very young James Tate with Gordon Kearney in James's video.
Yeah, I think it was right after The Lost Pilot.
It was, exactly then. And, but I sort of think also, I can't separate the Grolier from the Plough and the Stars and from other places that have the same clientele and the same atmosphere of fun. It must have been a better time we were living in, because it didn't, well, McCarthy wasn't so great, but it had a different atmosphere that you can't really express. You can only find it in the poets now that you read, who carry that with them.
I had one more question, just with the Poets Theater crowd. Was there any intersection there with those people?
Oh, there would have been, absolutely, yeah. And yeah, the theater thing of playwriting from people from inside the bookstore. Yeah. And Richard Wilbur, yeah.
You mentioned Paul Hannigan, and Paul Hannigan may be a name that maybe isn't so familiar to people. I mean, people know James Tate, but Paul Hannigan, who was, I thought, a really remarkable poet.
Yeah, he was.
Not very friendly, but...
He was not friendly, but he told a great story once. Stratus and I went to his house, and he started speaking Greek to Stratus.
Oh,
and
amazing.
Paul Hannigan never finished college. And he had dropped out of Columbia. Anyway, he started speaking Greek, and Stratus says, how did this happen? And he said, oh, I wanted to learn how to read the Odyssey, so I taught myself Greek. So
Wow.
there was a side of him, I mean, I know what you mean, he was like complicated and grumpy. And
Those were hangovers.
yeah, and I once tried to drink as much as Paul, and I realized I'd die before I was 25 if I did anything, if I lived like he did. I mean, we would go to Stratus and I would go to his house, and he'd pull out a bottle of bourbon or something, and we would, he'd say, oh, we'll get takeout, and I don't think the takeout ever came, or if it did, I was completely unaware that there was food on the table. And then Sam Cornish was like that.
Oh.
I mean, Sam Cornish, I remember, went to his house, and his idea of dinner was Spam cooked in barbecue sauce and bourbon. And he's like, well, this is how I grew up. And I thought, I don't want to eat what I grew up with. And I don't want to eat what you grew up with. So I never went back to his house for dinner.
But Sam Cornish, most of you probably know, is the first Boston Poet Laureate. And the New England Poetry Club now has a prize named after him in his honor.
No, I feel like, I feel lucky that I found the bookstore. I grew up in Brookline, Mass, and I read a little article in the Globe, Boston Globe, that said there was a bookstore that only sold poetry. And I was 16, and I hopped on the trolley. And Gordon was very friendly to me the moment I went in. There were these men smoking. But it didn't bother me, and they didn't say anything to me, and I think, also I was the only Chinese kid that ever walked into that bookstore, so somehow I think they just were like, who's this alien that's come in? Let's be nice to him. And I met Amiel Alkali there, who was also,
wow.
he was, I think, a year and a half older than me, and we would kind of meet each other and hang out and talk. And I mean, it changed my life. And I was interesting to see all those people, Bill Corbett and all those people, because I kind of, so I was like 17. I met them later when I graduated from Bard and came back, but I had known about their work since I was in high school. And I read Robert Kelly's books when I was there. I mean, the way I learned poetry, because I went to Boston University, and I was in the College of Basic Studies, which means that you were an underachiever. I graduated in the bottom 10th of my high school, and they told me to go into the Air Force in the middle of the Vietnam War to learn discipline. And I thought, wait, this is not going to work. So anyway, I went to college against I didn't want to. And then I went to Bard. And the reason I went to Bard was I had this, they didn't teach poetry in the College of Basic Studies. So I bought lots of anthologies. I was the only way I could figure out who am I going to buy as a poet. And I just bought one anthology out, Hayden Carruth, John Malcolm Brennan, and then Robert Kelly. Robert Kelly is a controversial poet. And in that anthology, and Images Poets by William Pratt, and I just thought, this is how I'll learn how to write poetry. And then when I read that anthology, I saw that all these people taught at Bard College. And I thought, well, if they're all there, maybe I should try and go there. And I got in. I mean, and also, again, it was like, I remember I showed up on campus. I was a transfer student. All the English professors were saying hello to me. I went, wow, they know who I am. And then, of course, I was the only Asian American in the whole entire school, like 700 students. They didn't have to look far to figure out, oh, that must be him, you know. And I had gotten in on my essays because I also was later told that I had terrible grades at the College of Basic Studies because I just was bored with it. And suddenly I was in Bard, and I was like, oh, this is really a challenge. This is fun. So it did. The Grolier
All those
changed.
books you got at the Grolier? The Robert Kelly?
I bought them all at the Grolier, and then I got into a car accident at Bard, and I spent 8 months in double traction. And Gordon wrote me a letter. I don't know how he found out, addressed to me at the hospital. And he said, any books you want, you should order them. I will send them to you. And you can pay me when you get out of the hospital. So I got, I remember getting Shelley, it was blue Oxford edition, the orange Oxford edition of William. I just it was like a dream come true. Like I didn't have any money, and this man is saying, whatever book you want, tell me. I mean, I remember getting, I think, Adrian Rich's Diving. I mean, I just would find out about books, write them down, send him a note, and he would send them to me with a little bill, which I didn't pay for. I don't think I paid right after I got out of college, believe me. I took a while to pay him, and he didn't seem to ever get upset about it. So I have a lot to thank him for,
Gail? What are your...
Wow.
What?
I'm lost. I'm lost in the past. When I first went to the Grolier, it was because my oldest and dearest friend, Elsa Dorfman, took me there, and she was completely at home almost everywhere, I think. But at the time, my children were like 3 and 4. So I was there in the sort of before the party hours. I was there, maybe I'd get there at 11 o'clock and look at books and talk to Gordon. I'd never seen a poetry bookstore before in my life. And we had moved from Providence, where my husband taught at RISD, to Cambridge because Providence was so boring. And Elsa her little bicycle met me at the Grolier, and my life was sort of changed by it. At the time, of course, Gordon Kearney was the owner, and he seemed to be very fond of me immediately, but he always called me Henry. And I didn't know whether it was denying that I was a woman. I didn't know what it was, but it turned out that Gordon, who was really a very sensitive man, had several years before, driving in New Hampshire, killed a child named Gail in a car accident, and that it was really hard for him to say my name.
Wow.
And yet somehow we had a bond. But so I saw him in those hours before the boys arrived, which was very different. I made these aren't exactly notes, but they're anecdotal notes. But Gordon would say, let me see what Gordon would say. He called me Henry. Poor Cal, he said about Lowell. Poor Cal. Gordon was very shy. Poor Cal. I never can think of a thing to say to him. Which I always loved too. So for me, it was not a place that a lot of people who came later, like Lloyd, found with a sort of group of boyos who weren't the people that Gordon had always loved, but they had sort of taken over a certain number of hours of the Grolier then, being jobless. But on the couch of the Grolier were letters from Omar Pound and Ezra Pound, and I mean, you know, stuffed in between the cushions. I remember when I came in, there were already lots of portrait photographs on the wall, and one was William Carlos Williams, whom Gordon had draped a black ribbon around because he had died, which stayed there for the rest of Gordon's life and maybe the rest of the Grolier's life. I don't know, but there was always a sense of history, and it wasn't only, although often, mostly, the history of male poets. Elizabeth Bishop was a beloved poet in the Grolier as well as out, and she wasn't, she didn't hang out. She wasn't coming in at 5 to be with the boyos, but I met so much there that I'm not sure how to measure how much it changed my life, because being taken there in the daytime before the gang arrived, for one thing, was really made me very comfortable there, you know. And since Gordon was only calling me Henry, I didn't know he had any ulterior motives on me.
Was there some connection between the Grolier and your founding the Blacksmith House series?
Yes, Gordon died. That was the connection. I didn't know what. It was a poetry center. No matter what people thought about the boyos and everything else, it still was a poetry center. A bookstore like that, just what was in the bookstore, was so unusual for most of us from the towns we came in, and if they had bookstores, the bookstores we learned to love, which we did. But I'm trying to remember. I mean, it was so shocking to think the Grolier was going to close. If I had known that it wasn't going to close, I might have never started the Blacksmith House. You know, I mean, but I never regretted that I did, because it just really expanded the poetry world, and it's with all its
I'm just going to ask a question I already know the answer to, but who were the first two readers, the first two poets at the Blacksmith House?
You do know the answer?
Yeah.
Tell me.
Well, Bill Corbett and Fanny.
That's right. Fanny was the first poet.
So your portrait's not on the wall.
No, it isn't.
But what a
I
history.
think I just got stage fright just then when you asked me
Oh,
that.
sorry.
It was so important.
It was.
But it really, I really do owe starting the Blacksmith House to the Grolier, because I had this little hint of what a poetry, I don't want to say gang, I don't want to say mafia, but you know, what a poetry community in all its diversity of taste, etc., could be. And I thought it was just going to vanish because I'd never seen anything like it before. So that was really part of it.
Well, you also gave me my first reading.
Hmm?
You gave me my first reading.
I can't hear you. What?
You gave me my first reading, and I was just
Well,
had
we were
barely
all so
gotten out.
young.
I know.
You know,
I just gotten out of
we
Bard.
gave everyone. I probably gave myself my first reading, but not early in the game.
Yeah, no, and I think it was the first time I ever read in
But
public.
I mean, probably
actually,
several people here did their first reading there, and you know, people talked about the Grolier sometimes as a men's club, and it was, I think, because of that little afternoon group that came in the afternoon.
Who was
And
it?
It's also
in that?
because poets are shy.
it was Bill Corbett, Paul Hannigan, and maybe one or two other people.
Well,
Ja-
Lowell
Ja-
would show up there.
And poor Lowell, Gordon couldn't think of a thing to say to him.
I know, but poor Cal, that's the real, I mean, that's
Yeah, poor
exact.
Cal.
When I
Poor
first
Cal.
met Elizabeth
And I
Hardwick,
don't,
that's
I
what
don't
she
remember
said.
Lowell
Poor
actually
Cal.
hanging out for long.
What?
You know, I mean,
No, I
because he
don't.
wasn't like that. But that was all part of, you know, I remember Louisa and me coming out of the Grolier to go to lunch after Gordon had died. And Seamus was walking up the street. And he said, the two muses of poetry. And I said, if it amuses you to say so. I mean, poor Seamus was innocent of his sexism, and he didn't know what the symbols of it were.
Right.
But there was a little anecdote that I had here somewhere that I wanted to. Anyway, that was my graduate school, sitting on the couch stuffed with books and letters from Omar Pound and Ezra Pound and Creeley. I don't think we fully realized how heroic Louisa was to take it over.
Right.
Because
That's true.
the guys weren't for her, for one thing.
No.
I mean, that was a big part of it. But also, Gordon had a wealthy wife. Louisa really had to make that store work
Right.
on her own, you know. And she did a good job, impossible though she might have been, you know.
Or became, at least.
What?
Or became.
Yeah, she wasn't
at least.
impossible when I first went there in
Right,
the 70s.
it's certainly moving to see those young photographs
Oh,
of
yeah.
her.
Yeah,
But I
beautiful.
think because if you think of the way the Grolier was when Gordon was youngish and alive, and think of Louisa moving into that, it was all men. Really?
Totally, yeah.
But, you know, that is where I met Elizabeth Bishop for the first time.
Can you describe that?
You know, and several other people.
Gail, can you describe that?
What?
Can you describe meeting Elizabeth Bishop at the Grolier?
Well, there's not much to say. She was at the Grolier.
Yeah, well.
I was incredibly shy, and I met her.
No, but that's the Elizabeth Bishop
and
story.
She seemed she was lovely. I mean, I think she was shy too. So, I mean, we didn't hang out because we were shy, but you know, it was, you know, I can't. It's hard to put together all the memories of people who met each other there. Even people who were in this room who didn't romanticize the Grolier at all. I did, because I found a poetry bookstore there, and a world. I didn't stay in it so much after Louisa took over, because she didn't call me Henry. So I didn't feel loved in that way. And of course, my friend Elsa took so many portraits of poets who came in there that are hanging on the wall now. And that maybe was part of starting her.
Yeah, how did that come about?
Her photographs have really...
How did that evolve, that she was taking photos there?
Well, all I know is that Louisa... Oops. Is...
Just thought I'd do that subtly.
Oh, my time is up.
Sorry, Jeff, the sound guy.
It's all right. Here he comes.
Sorry. What did you ask me?
I was just curious how, yeah. I was just curious how, I've always taken it for granted that these photos exist on the walls that Elsa took. But if it was a kind of boys' club, how did she come to be? Was she there taking photos, or did she meet people there and then took photos of them?
Are we still talking about Elizabeth Bishop? I have no idea.
Elsa.
Oh, Elsa. Elsa had worked in New York for a publisher 1 year, but she was very friendly somehow with Ginsberg and Creeley and everybody. And they could come to where she worked, and she would mimeo their poems, you know, so so when she moved up here, I think Creeley knew the Grolier really well, because he had gone here to school, and Ginsberg, because he knew everything, and everybody, and they were lifelong dear friends of Elsa's.
Well, what happened was, Elsa decided her first, most important thing in her life was getting out of Newton. And she decided she's going to try New York. She worked for 1 year at Grove Press. She met Robert Creeley, Anais Nin, Allen Ginsberg, Peter Orlovsky. There were 20 or 25 major poets. That's how it all started. She then moved. She said New York was too much for her, I think was the line. She moved back to Cambridge. But every time any of those poets came in this area, they stayed over our house. We ran a hotel for poets. And one of my favorite stories is when Allen Ginsberg and Peter Orlovsky were staying over. And Elsa called me at the office and said, "We're going to go over to the Grolier to take some pictures. So on your way, so when you get out of the Harvard Square subway stop, instead of coming to Franklin Street, stop it at the Grolier." So I get to the Grolier. Gordon wouldn't let me in unless I left my law books on the steps outside. He said, "This is a poetry bookshop, no law books." So Paul Freund's constitutional law text, which was the iconic constitutional law text, was sitting on the steps, and I walked in. And he wouldn't let me in with my law books. True story.
I have one last question for you. had heard that you used to write a note for, Elsa used to sell her photos of the poets out in a cart in Harvard Square, and the cops would like try to force her not to, and you wrote her some sort of...
Yeah, the cops in Harvard Square insisted that Elsa needed a peddler's license to sell her photographs. And I argued that she was not selling wares, she was selling intellectual product, and that it wasn't covered by the requirement of getting a peddler's permit. And the cops insisted until I said, well then, I'm going to have to meet you in court. And that's when they let her stay. And she was able to sell her stuff out of the supermarket cart that she used to borrow. And then when the winter came, she would return it, and she'd take it back in the spring. By the way, $2.50. It was $2.50 a picture for works that are now going for $3,000. Amazing. Oh, I don't know how much poetry books.
$1.85.
Yes, yeah.
I think that's what I paid for Jim Tate's book, $1.85.
$1.85. Robert.
Yeah, I told them instead of speaking, I would do interpretive dance. It turns out I did. I think I had experience similar to Lloyd's and other people. Maybe what I can contribute is my reminiscences of Ifeanyi Menkidi. And I am, in a sense, a person of the Menkidi era. Ifeanyi and I were both born in 1940. He was born in August, I was born in October. I used to like to tease him that he was older than me, and that's the only reason he was wiser. Ifeanyi, people who teach philosophy sometimes say, I was a philosophy professor, not a philosopher. Ifeanyi Menkidi was a philosopher. And I believe that there's a cultural history of the Grolier bookstore. That's one of the few cultural histories where things in our country improve. In the Igbo or African view of the world, as I'm talking through my hat from what I absorbed from Ifeanyi's writing, identity is profoundly social compared to more Western or American ideas of who you are. A thing I quote in one of my poems that Ifeanyi said was that in his culture, a baby is not her or him until it learns to be a person. The baby is it. It must learn to become human. I was patrolling my computer this afternoon, and I looked for things about Ifeanyi. I don't know where, at some event, I said, sometimes the life of imagination can seem separate from, even alien to, life in a community. Ifeanyi has been a model for me of envisioning the two as one. Life of the imagination, life of the community. All due respect to Gordon Kearney, the origins of the store were in upper class, ruling class collectors of books, fine books. There's a book called The Chosen, written about college admissions. When I first read that James Carable, I thought it was about anti-Semitism. And it is. It quotes these letters, shameless letters, from the presidents, deans, admissions directors at Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and so forth. But much more shocking than anti-Semitism, which is standard. You know, that's the ho-hum. They're anti-intellectual. We mustn't have more than a 10% quota of highbrows, and then a few surreptitiously anti-gay and somewhat anti-Semitic remarks about who these brains are likely to be. So if some innocent kid in living memory got all right on the college boards, 800 in math, 800 in verbal, and thinks, oh, I can go, works against you because it was anti-intellectual. So there are good things about every ruling class. Ruling classes often, in many cultures, keep arts like poetry alive. That was an era. That was replaced by the blessed transition of Luisa Solano got rid of the couch.
Right.
She put literary magazines in where the couch used to be, and it became less of a club and more of a store, as though it went from a ruling class to a middle class cultural phenomenon. Ifeanyi is none of the above. He has the book, his final book of poems. I remember at Wellesley, he and I were young Wellesley professors together, and in our different ways, we felt like misfits. We were young puppies who wrote poetry. I can still remember some poetry reading we gave at Wellesley. Ifeanyi, we just immediately felt we had Igbo and New Jersey are different enough, yet in some sense it was the same. And I remember enjoying hear him read at Wellesley College in some room there, his poem about the delicious smell of fish heads when they simmer.
Mm-hmm.
They smell like garlic.
That's his favorite
And I knew what he was talking about, and I understood his pleasure of reading the poem there at Wellesley. And his poems are like neighborhood gossip and kidding, and they're schmoozing. And they are deeply social. They are like that philosophical idea that the child is in it and learns how to be one of us. And his book of poems, the last one was called Coming to America, taking the title from a movie that was popular then. And he will look at he'll look at plastic bottles and what's against them. He'll look at video cameras and cell phones. He looked at the NBA. And in a perfectly smiling, benign way, he will see it from the outside. I'm going to read this poem by Ifeanyi when this is done, and then I'll say 2 or 3 sentences about the ending of the poem. It's not long. When this is done, and the young become old, the old become elders, and elders become spirits, and spirits, what can be said of them? That those who have traveled to a far country, the far country returns them, but only after they're done to journey, therefore, from that place on to the great pyramid of Saqqara, riding the late express to Brooklyn. The philosopher, how he ends up where he began, and the poet, something he thought might yet bring back that hour of splendor in the grassy field that neither Wordsworth nor Okigbo saw the need to reveal the secret of this mystery. The young, they will become old. The old will become elders. The elders' spirithood awaits them when this is all done. And that our God not fail us, a prayer said at morning light, but also at evening time. He's going to now allude to a bestseller at the time. A rose claims a name for itself. The rose does not belong to Umberto alone. We who were not invited to the feast, yet we came to the table anyway. Jerusalem was builded there. And the ending of the poem, Jerusalem was builded there, it has that wry neighborhood gossip and wit, that endlessly smiling accepting and critical moment. And if the store went from the club to the store to whatever it is now, I more than approve of that evolution.
Carol.
I would like to respond. Thank you so much. Actually, the most important thing to Ifeanyi's people, who are the Igbo people of Nigeria, is community. And I think more than anything, he wanted the store to be a community of poets. And James has bought that wholesale. He's increased the number of poets from around the world, the gay poets, and all kinds of poets. And I feel that that has added so much to the store and the appreciation of the store. In fact, my daughter was here, Dee Dee, she helps James with the financial part of the store for taxes and things. But she has a little baby who is 8 months old. His name is Ikemba, which means the community is great. And so that's how we feel about what is happening at the Grolier with James and with the whole feeling that he has instilled in himself. And when interns come from Bennington College, they come to us free, and we have them over their winter sessions, and they understand that. And since that has happened, interns are coming from Harvard, from all around, to offer their help. And we don't pay them. They just give it because they love the store. And I think it's because they feel the warmth of the store. And to tell you the truth, Ifeanyi's relationship with Louisa at the time, Ifeanyi always talked about the Grolier, and I'm not a poet, but he talked about it, how much he loved going there. And Louisa loved our family. At the time, we had 4 young children. She invited us over to dinner. She would feed us in that apartment that was above the store. She had Pumpkin, which we all loved and watched. And so to us, we really didn't know that side of Louisa that became negative. We only knew her as a friend. And the saddest time for me was when I used to go into the Grolier and say, Louisa, I've got to get Ifeanyi a birthday present. What poet should I buy? She would always direct me right away to somebody. But the saddest day I ever had when I went into the Grolier was when Louisa was over the counter crying. And I said, Louisa, what is wrong? She said, I cannot pay the bills anymore. I cannot thrive as, owning this store. But she said, some poets have volunteered to pay for the rent. I want Ifeanyi to own the store. And so she literally chose Ifeanyi to own the store. And nothing delighted him more than that. He probably sacrificed a life to buy it, but he loved the place. He thought it was sacred. And we still feel that it's sacred. And we hope that everybody who ever visits there or goes there feels the same way, because we think James feels the same way. He shares so much Ifeanyi's attitude about poetry and about the store and everything. So I thank you so much for bringing that up, because to me it's very important. Yeah.
So it's your turn to share some stories, or if you have any questions for us, or memories of. Ron.
Rod Kessler here. I also went into the Grolier in the old days. I was an undergraduate at Harvard. It must have been in 68, 67. And I remember Gordon very clearly, because the first thing he said to me was, "Shut the door, damn it." he asked me, "Are you a poet?" And very shyly said, "No, well, not me, I'm not a poet. What do you want?" I said, "Well, do you have any work by Jean Durwood?" "Who?" "Jean Durwood." Now, in those days, there was a big table in the Grolier piled with books, helter-skelter. You just go look through it. I was looking through this pile. 5 minutes later, he comes over with this book by Jean Durwood. He says, "She was Oscar Williams' wife, right?" I said, "Well, I don't know. I just had heard her on the Cadman records." Yeah, I'm pretty sure she was Oscar Williams' wife." And he knew everything. And so that was my exposure to it. I remember that messy, complicated table. And of course, when Louisa took over, that was gone, and it was orderly and alphabetical, and there were sections. So I just thought I would mention that transition.
Thank you. Thanks, Rod. Peter.
Hey, thank you.
Well, I mean,
Peter and then Doug.
Okay, I just wanted to say that I knew Louisa since 1974. I moved to Cambridge in 1972, and I became a poet. And one of the first things I did was go to the bookstore, and she's always very welcoming to me. And I always say I was the last person standing who was still her friend. And in fact, one of my memories is, remember we had like a dance at Old Cambridge Baptist Church to raise money? And I don't remember what year it was, but all I remember is that Louisa grabbed me and made me dance to Love Shack. So that was one of the cool memories. But I also was one of the founders, I was the founder of Phonopoem back in 1974. And every little innovation that I did, Louisa always was very supportive of me. I said, I want to do this thing called Phonopoem. She let me put a little, I'd type something up, we put it in a window. And then we'd have so many people who would read the next month, and I had that in a window. Then I wanted to start a poetry basketball team, and she put that in a window. We started that. We started a poetry softball team. I did poetry and fortune cookies. But what I'm saying is everything that I had an idea with, she was very supportive. And so I always felt like she's a good friend. And like I said, I was the last person standing, and I can tell you when she turned against me, but I'm not going to tell the story. But it's okay, I want to leave it positive. But I do also want to say that when I started Phonopoem, it's like a little machine that's in my living room. And at one time, Gail, Robert, and Lloyd were all in the living room together recording. So that would have been an historic picture to have right there. Okay, and then in I think it was 77, a year later, or maybe 78, we did the 50th anniversary. And the people who read were a bunch of people, but it was me, Lloyd, Robert, and Gail were included. So maybe when the 100th anniversary comes, if we're still alive, we can do a recap of that.
Good.
We make it a band called The Usual Suspects.
Let me say one more thing. That when I came here, I was like the young punk from Jersey. I didn't go to Harvard. I was just a guy who published all my poems in Paris Review and stuff like that. But I got to out Robert, because he's from Jersey, too. He always just tries to hide it. Okay.
Thanks, Peter.
I'm from Jersey, too, for the record.
Oh. Doug?
Well, I mean, I first went to the Grolier, and it was in the 70s when I was a student, but I never really hung out there. But years later, I was writing poetry, and people advised me to go to the Grolier Poetry Bookstore, and I walk in there, and because I wanted advice about publishing poetry, so I walk in there. She's looking at me like I'm a gutter snipe or something, and I said, "Look, can you give me some advice about publishing poetry?" So she showed me in the International Dictionary of Poetry and Poetry Publishers by Len Fulton, who I became friendly with, and wrote for this small press review, but. And years later, when I first showed her my first chapbook, she said it was horrible, and she was right. And but had the interview. I've interviewed her over the years, and some are in the Harvard Library, and you know, I was just going over the interviews, and you know, she has some amusing stories. Since I worked at McLean Hospital for many years, I always like to hear about bizarre stories. And one was she told me about how this guy came screaming into the Grolier, saying and yelling at his professor that he stole his mind, and she calmed him down, brought him down to a neighborhood, you know, mental health center, and then she didn't like pompous people, and she was one gentleman who came in, and he wasn't nice to her, and you know, she surely wasn't nice to him, and he said to her, "I've never been treated this way." And she said, "Well, it's a good experience, your first experience."
Mark.
I was fortunate having a young son who would come to the Grolier with me, who befriended Pumpkin. So I think that was how my friendship with Louisa survived her evolution to being a little crazy and paranoid. But my favorite story was she would call me up to resupply her with books from Hanging Loose Press, which I would do, and she would call the house and say, "Well, Pumpkin's calling for Johnny," which is my son. And so Johnny would get on the phone and have a little conversation with Louisa, and then you know, and apparently Pumpkin would bark or do something, and then finally she would say, "Okay, Mark, you know, we need 5 more copies of of this book and 5 more copies of that book, etc." And so it was a lovely, sweet relationship.
Great. Jack, do you want to say anything? Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I knew Louisa, and I knew her through Jim Randall, Dr. Randall, as we called him at Emerson College, because I went to Emerson College for my BFA. And I started writing picture books for Houghton Mifflin, and Jim Randall said to me, "Oh, you know, if you're writing and if you're publishing, there's one place you have to go." And I was like, "Well, okay." So he said, "Meet me at the Grolier." So I went over to the Grolier, and it was pretty fantastic. And so I started going back and buying more poetry. And since I was working on a lot of picture books, poetry and picture books really sort of have a lot in common. So it really was lovely. And then I don't know how this happened, but listening to your stories, there seems to be a disconnect in every story. So everything's going right, and then something goes wrong. And then one day I showed up, and she said, "You can't come in here." And I said, "Why?" And she said, "You're a bigamist." And I was shocked, and I said, "I'm not a bigamist. I'm not married." And she said, "Yes, you are. You're a bigamist." And she would not, from that day forward, she would never allow me in the store. And I used to send other people in there to buy the books for me. But I loved her. I mean, who would have the guts to step out there and just take a crack at you like that? And I was like, well, she defended herself.
Wow.
Thank you.
I actually have a question for James, and this was not prepared, but I don't know how you got started at the Grolier. And what brought you to the Grolier? Because we're so grateful to you.
Hello, everybody. I'm not much of a public speaker, so I'll keep this brief. But I want to thank you all for this wonderful event. Thank you to the Mankiti family for keeping the Grolier open. Thank you to the curators at the Woodbury for envisioning this entire event. To answer your question, it's all thanks to Elizabeth Duran, the former manager of the Grolier, for inviting me. Let's give Elizabeth a round of applause. I was studying literature at Emerson College at the time, and I went to high school with Elizabeth's daughter, Kat, and Elizabeth knew I loved poetry, and I helped out with the 90th anniversary celebration, which was wonderful, and then I later became a part-time bookseller, and then as time went on, I kept selling books, and here we are at 96 years. It's an amazing thing. So immensely grateful to be here.
I think we have Christina has an announcement and an invitation to us. Do you not?
Yeah. Well, Robert and I are going to dance. Yeah, at the reception, which is at the Poetry Room. There's food, cake, and an exhibit. So we welcome you over there. Please join us.